Now a ghost is rising up to the sky. All you did was say goodbye. And I died.
Chapter 92. When Sally and Betsy asked her questions about her past, Lorena was perplexed. They were just girls. She couldn't tell them the truth. They both idolized her and made much of her adventure in crossing the prairies. Betsy had a lively curiosity and could ask about 100 questions in an hour. Sally was more reserved and often chided her sister for prying into Lorena's affairs. "She don't have to tell you about her whole life," Sally would protest. "Maybe she can't remember. I can only remember back to when I was 3. "What happened when you were 3? Lorena asked. "That old turkey pecked me," Sally said. "A wolf got him, and I'm glad." Clara overheard part of the conversation. "I'm getting some more turkeys pretty soon," she said. "Lori's so good with the poultry. I think we might raise a few." The poultry chores had been assigned to Lorena, mainly just feeding the 25 or 30 hens and gathering eggs. At first, it seemed that such a small household couldn't possibly need so many eggs, and yet they absorbed them effortlessly. July Johnson was a big egg eater, and Clara, who had a ferocious sweet tooth, used to use them in cakes she was always making. She made so many cakes that everyone got tired of them except for her. "I gotta have sweets at least," Clara said, eating a piece of cake before she went to bed or, again, while she was cooking breakfast. "Sweets make up for a lot." It didn't seem to Lorena that Clara had much that needed making up for. She mostly did what she pleased, and what she pleased usually had to do with horses. Housework didn't interest her, and washing in particular didn't interest her. That became Lorena's job too, though the girls helped. They asked questions all the time they worked. And Lorena just gave them whatever answers came into her head, few of them true answers. She didn't know if the answers fooled them. The girls were smart. Sometimes she knew she didn't fool them. "Are you going to marry that man?" Betsy asked one day. "He's already got white hair." "Well, that's no reason not to marry him," Sally said. "It is too," Betsy insisted. "If he's got white hair, he could die any time." Lorena found that she didn't think about Gus all that much. She was glad she'd stayed at Clara's. For almost the first time in her life, she had a decent bed in a clean room and tasteful meals and people around who were kind to her. She liked having a whole room to herself, alone. Of course, she had had a room in Lonesome Dove, but it hadn't been the same. Men could come into that room. Letting him in was a condition of having it. But she didn't have to let anyone into her room at Clara's house. Though often she did let Betsy, who suffered from nightmares, into it. One night Betsy stumbled in, crying. Clara was out of the house, taking one of the strange walks she liked to take. Lorena was surprised and offered to go find Clara, but Betsy wasn't listening. She came into the bed like a small animal and snuggled into Lorena's arms. Lorena let her stay the night, and from then on, when Betsy had a nightmare, she came to Lorena's room, and Lorena soothed her. Only now and then did she miss Gus, though then she missed him with a painful ache and felt almost desperate to see him. At such times she felt cowardly for not having gone with him, though of course he himself had urged her to stay. She didn't miss the rest of it at all. The cowboys watching her and thinking things about her, the hot tent, the unpredictable storms, and the fleas and mosquitoes that were always there. She didn't miss the fear either. The fear that someday Gus would be off somewhere and Blue Duck would come back. What had happened had been bad enough, but she knew if he ever got her again, it'd be worse. Fearing him and missing Gus were mixed together, for Gus was the only person who could protect her from him. Unlike the girls, Clara seldom asked any questions. Lorena came to wish that she would. For a while, she had the urge to apologize to Clara for not having always been able to be a lady. It still seemed to her a miracle that she'd been able to stay in Clara's house and be one of the family. She looked for it to go bad in some way, but it didn't go bad. The only thing that changed was that Clara spent more and more time with the horses and less time in the house. "You came at a good time," she said one day as Lorena was coming in from feeding the hens. It was a task Lorena enjoyed. She liked the way the hens chirped and complained. "How's that?" Lorena asked. I nagged Bob to build this house. I don't really care about a house, Clara said. We needed it for the girls, but that wasn't why I built it. I just wanted to nag him into it, and I did. The main reason was he wouldn't let me work with the horses, although I'm better with them than he ever was. But he didn't think it fitting, so I thought, all right, then Bob, build me a house. But I'd rather be down with the horses. And now, there's nothing to stop me. 2 weeks later, Bob died in the night. Clara went in the morning to change him and found him dead. He looked exactly as he had. He was just no longer breathing. He weighed so little by then that she could lift him, having long concluded that he would die. She had had Cholo bring a pine coffin from town. He had brought it in at night and hidden it from the girls. It was ready. Clara closed Bob's eyes and sat with her memories for an hour. The girls were downstairs now, pestering Lorena and eating. Now and then she could hear their laughter. They were happy girls. They laughed often. It pleased Clara to hear them. She wondered if Bob could hear his 2 lively daughters laughing as he lay dying. She wondered if it helped, if it made up in any way for her bad tempers and the deaths of the 3 boys. He had so counted on those boys. They would be his help boys. Bob had never talked much, but the one thing he did talk about was how much they would get done once the boys got big enough to do their part of the work. Often just hearing him describe the fences they would build, or the barns, or the cattle they'd buy, Claire felt out of sorts. It made her feel very distant from Bob that he saw their boys mainly as hired hands that he wouldn't have to pay. He sees them different, she thought. For her part, she just liked to have them there. She liked to look at them as they sat around the table, liked to watch them swimming and frolicking in the river, liked to sit by them sometimes when they slept, listen to them breathe. Yet they had died, and both she and Bob lost what they loved. Bob his dreams of future work with his sons, she the immediate pleasure of having sons to look at, to touch, to scold and tease and kiss. It struck her that endings were never as you would expect them to be. She had thought she would be relieved when Bob finally died. She hadn't felt he was a part of their life anymore, and yet now that he was gone, she knew he had been. A silent part, an uncomfortable part, but still there, still her husband, still the girl's father. He had been changed, but not removed. Now he had gone where her boys had gone. As well as she knew the boys, as much as she loved them, time had robbed her of them. At times she found herself mixing details and events up, not in big ways, but in small. In dreams she saw her sons' faces, and when she awoke, could not remember which son she had dreamt about. She wondered if she had dreamed of Bob, and what she would remember if she thought of him in 10 years. Their marriage had had few high spots. She had often been happy during it, but not because of anything Bob did. She had more happiness from horses than from her husband, though he had been a decent husband, better than most women had from what she could judge. She didn't cry, but merely felt a wish, now he was gone, that she could somehow escape dealing with the tiresome formalities of death. Someone would have to go for a preacher. There would have to be some kind of funeral. They had no close neighbors, but the 2 or 3 closest would still feel they had to come, bring food, pay their respects. She covered Bob with a clean sheet and went downstairs. Lorena was teaching the girls to play cards. They were playing poker for buttons. Claire stood in the shadows, wishing she didn't have to interrupt the fun. Why interrupt it for a death if that couldn't be helped? And yet death was not something you could ignore. It had its weight. It was a dead man lying upstairs, not a man who was sick. It seemed to her she'd better not form the practice of ignoring death. If she tried it, death would find a way to answer back. It would take another of her loved ones to remind her to respect it. So she walked into the room. Betsy had just won a hand. She whooped, for she loves to beat her sister. She was a beautiful child, with curls that would drive men mad someday. "I won the pot, Ma," she said, and then saw by the grave set of Clara's face that something was wrong. "Good," Clara said. "A good card player is just what the family needs. Now I have to tell you something sad. Your father's dead." "Oh, he ain't," Sally said. "Honey, he died just now." Sally ran to her, but Betsy turned to Lorena, who was nearer. Lorena was surprised, but she put her arms around the child. "Could you go get July?" Claire asked Lorena when the girls had calmed a bit. July now lived in a little room attached to the saddle shed. It wouldn't do when winter came, but for summer it was all right. He had never felt comfortable in the house with Clara and the girls. And since Lorena had come, he felt even more uncomfortable. Lorena seldom spoke to him, and Clara mainly discussed horses or other ranch problems, yet he felt nervous in their company. Day to day, he felt it was wrong to have taken the job with Clara. Sometimes he felt a strong longing to be back at his old job in Fort Smith, even if Roscoe was no longer alive to be his deputy. But he had a son now, a baby he saw every day at supper and breakfast. His son was the darling of the ranch. The women and the girls passed Martin around as if he belonged to them all. Lorena had developed a rapport with him and took the main responsibility for him when Clara was off with the horses. The baby was happy, and no wonder, with 2 women and 2 girls to spoil him. July could hardly imagine what the women would do if he tried to take the baby and raise him in Arkansas. Anyway, such a plan was not feasible. So he stayed on and did his work, neither truly content nor bitterly discontented. He still dreamed of Elmira and felt an aching sadness when he thought of her. Despite that ache, the thing that made July least comfortable of all was that he knew he was in love with Clara. The feeling had started even before he knew Elmira was dead, and it grew even when he knew he ought to be grieving for Elmira. He felt guilty about it. He felt hopeless about it, but it was true. At night he thought of her and imagined her in her room, in her gown. At breakfast and supper he watched her whenever he thought he could do so without her noticing. He had many opportunities, too, for she seemed to have ceased taking any notice of him at all. He had the sense that she'd become disappointed in him, though he didn't know why. And when she did look at him, it frightened him. Occasionally, when he caught Clara looking at him, he almost flinched, for he did not imagine that he could hide anything from her. She was too smart. He had the sense that she could figure out anything. Her eyes were mysterious to him. Often she seemed to be amused by him, at other times irritated. Sometimes her eyes seemed to pierce him, as if she had decided to read his thoughts, as she would read a book. And then, in a moment, she would lift her head and ignore him, as if he were a book she had glanced through and found too uninteresting for further perusal. And she was married. Her husband lay sick above their heads, which made his love seem all the more hopeless. But it didn't stop the longing he felt for her. In his daydreams, he fell to reinventing the past, imagining that he had married Clara instead of Elmira. He gave himself a very different marriage. Clara wouldn't sit in the loft with her feet dangling all day. She wouldn't have run off on a whiskey boat. Probably she wouldn't have cared that Jake Spoon shot Benny. He imagined them raising horses and children together. Of course, they had begun to do just that, raise horses and children together. But the reality was far different from the daydream. They weren't together. He could not go into her room at night and talk to her. He knew that if he could, he probably wouldn't be able to think of much to say. Or if he did and said something stupid, Clara would answer sharply. Still, he longed for it. He lay awake at night in his little shed, thinking of her. He was doing that when Lorena came to tell him that Bob was dead. Hearing the footsteps, he had hoped it was Clara, and he pictured her face in his mind, not stern and impersonal, as it often was when she was directing some work, but soft and smiling, as it might be if she were playing with Martin at the dinner table. He opened the door and saw to his surprise that it was Lorena. "He died," Lorena said. "Who?" July asked absently. "Her husband," Lorena said. Then she's free, July thought. He couldn't feel sad. "Well, I guess it's for the best," he said. "Man wasn't getting no better." Lorena noticed that he sounded happier than she had heard him sound since she arrived at the ranch. She knew exactly what that meant. She had often seen him looking at Clara with helpless love in his eyes. She herself didn't care one way or the other about July Johnson, but the dumb quality of his love annoyed her. Many men had looked at her that way, and she was not flattered by it. They wanted to pretend, such men, that they were different, and that she was different, and that what might happen between them would be different than would ever be. They wanted to pretend that they wanted pretty dresses and smiles, when what they really wanted was for her to lay down under them. That was the real wish beneath all the pretty wishes men had. And when she was under them, they could look down and pretend something pretty was happening. But she would look up and only see a dumb face above her, strained, dishonest, and anything but pretty. "She wants you to bring the coffin," she said to July, watching him. Let Clara worry about the man. Watching him only made her long for Gus. He gave things that no one else could give. He wasn't dumb. He didn't pretend that he wanted smiles when he wanted a poke. They put the coffin in the front room, and July carried the frail corpse downstairs and put him in the coffin. Then, on Clara's instructions, he rode off to inform the few neighbors and to find a preacher. Clara and Lorena and the girls sat with the body all night while Cholo dug a grave on the ridge above the barn where the boys were buried. Betsy slept most of the night in Lorena's arms. Clara thought it nice that she had taken to the young woman so. At dawn, Clara went out and took Cholo some coffee. He had finished digging and was sitting on the mound of earth that would soon cover Bob. Walking toward the ridge in the early sunlight, Clara had the momentary sense that they were all watching her, the boys and Bob. The vision lasted a second. It was Cholo who was watching her. It was windy, and the grass waved over the graves of her 3 boys. 4 now, she felt. In memory, Bob seemed like a boy to her also. He had a boyish innocence and kept it to the end. Despite the strains of work or marriage in a rough place, it often irritated her, this innocence of his. She had felt it to be laziness. It left her alone to do the thinking, which she resented. Yet she had loved it too. He had never been a knowing man in the way that Gus was knowing, or even Jake Spoon. When she decided to marry Bob, Jake, who was a hothead, grew red in the face and proceeded to throw a fit. It disturbed him terribly that she had chosen someone he thought was dumb. Gus had been better behaved, if no less puzzled. She remembered how it pleased her to thwart them, to make them realize that her measure was different than theirs. "I'll always know where he is," she told Gus. It was the only explanation she ever offered. Now, indeed, she would know where he was. Cholo was watching her to see if she was hurt. He loved Clara completely and tried in small ways to make her life easier for her, although he had concluded long before that she wasn't seeking ease. Often in the morning when she came down to the lot, she'd be somber and would stay by the fence for an hour, not saying a word to anyone. Other times there'd be something working in her that scared the horses. He thought of Clara as like the clouds. Sometimes the small black clouds would pour out of the north. They seemed to roll over and over as they swept across the sky, like tumbleweeds. On some mornings things rolled inside Clara and made her tense and snappish. She could do nothing with the horses on days like that. They became as she was. And Cholo would gently try to persuade her that it was not a good day to do the work. Other days her spirit was quiet and calm, and the horses felt that too. Those were the days they made progress training them. Clara had brought 2 cups. She was very glad to be out of the house. She poured Cholo his coffee and then poured some for herself. She sat down on the mound of dirt beside him and looked into the open grave. "Sometimes it seems like grave digging is all we do," she said. "But that's wrong. I guess if we lived in a big town, it wouldn't seem that way. I guess in New York, there's so many people, you don't notice the dying so much. People come faster than they go. Out here, it shows more when people go, especially when it's your people." "Mr. Bob," Cholo said, "he didn't know mares," remembering that ignorance that had been his undoing. "Nope," Clara said, "he didn't know mares." They sat quietly for a while, drinking coffee. Watching Clara, Cholo felt sad. He did not believe she had ever been happy. Always her eyes seemed to be looking for something that wasn't there. She might look pleased for a time, watching her daughters or watching some young horse, but then the rolling would start inside her again. and the pleased look would give way to something that was sad. "What do you think happens when you die?" she asked, surprising him. Cholo shrugged. He had seen much death, but had not thought much about it. Time enough to think about it when it happened. "Not too much," he said. "You're just dead." "Maybe it ain't as big a change as we think," Clara said. "Maybe you just stay around near where you lived, near your family or wherever you was happiest. Only you're just a spirit, and you don't have the troubles the living have." A minute later, she shook her head and stood up. "I guess that's silly," she said, and started back to the house. That afternoon, July came back with a minister. The two nearest neighbors came, German families. Clara had seen more of the men than of the women. The men would come to buy horses and stay for a meal. She almost regretted having notified them. Why should they interrupt their work just to see Bob put in the ground? They sang 2 hymns, the German singing loudly in poor English. Mrs. Jench, the wife of one of the German farmers, weighed over 300 pounds. The girls had a hard time not staring at her. The buggy she rode in tilted far to one side under her weight. The minister was invited to stay the night and got rather drunk after supper. He was known to drink too much when he got the chance. His name was Reverend Spino, and he had a large purple birthmark under one ear. A widower, he was easily excited by the presence of women. He was writing a book on prophecy and rattled on about it as they all sat in the living room. Soon both Clara and Lorena felt like choking him. "Will you be thinking of moving into town now, Mrs. Allen?" the Reverend asked hopefully. It was worth the inconvenience of a funeral way out in the country to sit with 2 women for a while. "No, we'll be staying right here," Clara said. July and Cholo carried out the mattress Bob had died on. It needed a good airing. Betsy cried a long time that night, and Lorena went up to be with her. It was better than listening to a minister go on about prophecy. The baby was colicky, and Clara rocked him while the minister drank. July came in and asked if there was anything else she needed him to do. "No," Clara said, but July sat down anyway. He felt he should offer to rock his son, but knew the baby would just cry louder if he took him away from Clara. The minister finally fell asleep on the sofa and then, to their surprise, rolled off onto the floor and began to snore loudly. "Do you want me to carry him out?" July asked, hoping to feel useful. He could sleep in a wagon just as well. "Let him lie," Clara said, thinking it had been an odd day. "I doubt it's the first time he slept on a floor, and anyway, he isn't your lookout." She knew July was in love with her and was irritated that he was so awkward about it. He was as innocent as Bob, but she didn't feel moved to patience in July's case. She would save her patience for his son, who slept at her breast, whimpering now and then. Soon she got up with the baby and went to her room, leaving July sitting silently in a chair while the drunken minister snored on the floor. Once upstairs, she called Sally. Sally had not cried much. When she came into Clara's room, she looked drawn. Almost immediately, she began to sob. Clara put the baby down and held her daughter. "Oh, I'm so sad," Sally said, when she could talk. "I wanted Daddy to die. I didn't like it that he just lay up there with his eyes open. It was like he was a spook. Only now I wish he hadn't died." "Hush," Clara said. "You ain't bad. I wanted him to die too." "And now you wish he hadn't, Ma?" Sally asked. "I wish he had been more careful around horses is what I wish," Clara said.